Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Tea Time with Tara. I'm Tara, and it is really early. It feels really early because I am perpetually exhausted. I did just want to apologize for the delay in getting this episode out to you guys. Work has just been crazy, to be completely honest. So I'm just really busy with work and have not had the bandwidth to do this. I'm actually doing this instead of homework right now, so I am being a very bad example, but I've got time in a little bit for that. I did want to take advantage during the morning while everyone is still asleep. And welcome to my porch. It is still relatively quiet because it is still the morning time as I record this. And so here with me chilling on my porch and I have my coffee. Accidentally grabbed a little coffee mug for those of you who are watching or not watching rather, with a heart on it. So that felt really appropriate after the fact. Oh yes, my co-host this time is Emmy. Emmy's a good girl. Emmy. And so we're going to see how this goes with Emmy the good girl on the couch next to me. That's enough of that. Let's just get started. This is episode 2 of the Can We Talk miniseries. If you haven't listened to episode 1 yet, I highly recommend going back when you can, but this episode does stand alone as well. Grab your cup of coffee or tea, maybe some iced tea, depending on what time of day it is and how hot it is when you're listening or watching. And let's get settled in. Oh, love me some coffee. Today we are talking about something you feel before you can name. Something that gets missed even in the healthiest of relationships. Something that builds silently and slowly until one day you can't unfeel it. And that is emotional labor. Now, when I say emotional labor, I'm not just talking about helping someone through a hard time or being emotionally available in your relationship. I'm talking about the invisible, unspoken work that goes into managing how things feel. So, keeping the emotional climate stable, noticing when things are off, following up after conflict, or adjusting yourself, your tone, or your words so that someone else doesn't spiral. It's subtle, it's constant, and most of the time it's uneven. If you've ever thought, why am I always the one thinking about how we're doing? Or why do I notice these things and they don't? This episode is for you. This is also for you if your partner is talking to you about emotional labor, or if you're just curious about what emotional labor is, and if you are having your partner do a lot more of the emotional labor, or I mean, really, this is for everyone. I feel like this is just going to be good for everyone, but especially for those of you who feel like you are doing all of that emotional labor. So today we're going deep into what emotional labor is, where the imbalance starts, how it plays out across different relationships, and what it feels like when it becomes too much to carry. And we'll get into what you can do, because naming this is powerful, but shifting the dynamic is, of course, where the real change happens. We'll start with, what is emotional labor? It is always being the one to say, hey, can we talk about what happened yesterday? Talking yourself down from bringing something up that hurt you because it's not worth the fight. Remembering your partner's stressors and planning around them. Feeling like you need to package your truth gently so the other person won't feel attacked. Monitoring their tone, mood, and body language so you know how to navigate the conversation. And what makes this tricky is that it's not always a problem. We all do a little bit of that, right? Some of what I said, such as remembering what your partner's stressors are and planning around them, that's just being a good partner to an extent, right? Emotional labor is part of care, it's part of connection, but it becomes exhausting and harmful when it always feels one-sided. When one person is doing most of the work, keeping the emotional wheels turning, keeping the relationship in tune, and the other person doesn't realize it or just doesn't reciprocate, that's when emotional labor becomes a burden instead of a bond. Because when care becomes a job, and especially one you didn't necessarily agree to, that's when the burnout sets in. Because it's not always about the effort, it's about awareness. If you're constantly holding emotional space and the other person isn't aware of it, much less doing the same in return, that gap is where resentment starts to grow. Let's also talk about the mental load because the two often overlap. The emotional labor is doing and feeling, but the mental load is the thinking and planning behind it all. It's tracking the emotional calendar, remembering that your partner is stressed about a meeting tomorrow, so you might not want to bring up a tough conversation tonight. It's thinking through how to say something, when to say it, or even whether to say it. It's staying two steps ahead emotionally. And here's the part that most people miss. You don't always notice you're doing it. You just know you feel exhausted, even if nothing big has happened. That's the weight of the invisible work. You're working constantly, but because it's mental and emotional, not physical, it's easy to overlook. It's easy to say, well, I didn't do anything today, even though your brain and your heart have been running a marathon trying to manage the emotional environment of your relationship. So, emotional labor is very real. It's valuable and it's not always acknowledged until it stops. That's when the wheels fall off. That's when things feel tense, disconnected, or neglected. And no one can figure out why. Because the truth is, emotional labor only gets noticed when it's missing, when the person who usually carries it puts it down. And that's what we're here to unpack: how to name it before we get to that point, how to share the weight of emotional labor so that relationships don't rely on one person's silence, suppression, or sacrifice to survive. I think that we can all agree that we're probably like, all right, where does this come from? Why do some of us carry it while others don't? Let's talk about the roots of emotional labor, the deeper, often unconscious forces that shape who ends up carrying the weight in relationships. Let's start with gender socialization, because this piece alone lays the groundwork for so much of the imbalance in emotional labor. From a very early age, girls are taught directly and indirectly to prioritize emotional harmony. We're praised for being good, polite, helpful, and empathetic. Little girls are often put into caretaker roles. Watch your little brother or sister. Help grandma or mommy with the dishes. Don't make your sister cry. These expectations show up everywhere. At school, girls are told to be peacemakers. In families, they're expected to keep the household together. In media, they're shown that love is something they earn through patience, softness, and sacrifice. When a little girl does express anger or assertiveness, she's labeled as bossy, difficult, or dramatic. I'm pretty sure any woman listening can absolutely relate to that, even if you've only ever done it once. So, we learn to suppress, to soften, to adapt. Boys, on the other hand, often receive the opposite message. Boys don't cry. Man up. Be tough. Don't be a pussy, which is a whole other problematic statement, but we won't unpack that now. Emotions are framed as weaknesses, especially vulnerability. If a boy is sensitive, he's often mocked or shamed. If he needs help, he's told to figure it out. And if he expresses hurt, he's ignored or worse, punished. This doesn't mean boys don't feel, they do, but they learn very early on that feelings are dangerous, that opening up means losing power. So instead of expressing, they suppress or they outsource, often relying on the women in their lives to process feelings for them. And so we grow up. Girls become women who know how to soothe, listen, anticipate, and adapt. Boys become men who have learned to avoid, deflect, defend, or shut down, not because men don't care, but because no one ever gave them tools to do the emotional labor, let alone share it. It's not that women are naturally better at this. It's that we've been trained. It's not that men are incapable. It's that they've been conditioned to disengage. This is where the imbalance starts. It's so normalized that we don't even question it. We see it in who apologizes first, who remembers the emotional weight of last week's argument, who plans the birthday surprises, the deep talks, the relationship maintenance. It becomes second nature. But second nature isn't the same as fair. And when one partner is doing the majority of emotional labor, especially because of these deep rooted gender scripts, the relationship suffers. We'll dig deeper into early family dynamics, the default caretaker role, and trauma patterns next. But understanding gender socialization is the first step in understanding how we got here. Beyond gender, our own childhood homes shape how we engage with emotional labor. Our childhood homes often shape the emotional jobs we take on as adults. If you grew up in a home where emotions were unpredictable or unsafe, you may have learned to become the emotional manager without even realizing it. If your parent was quick to anger, you likely learned how to scan the room, read tone, silence, and micro expressions to know when to disappear, change the subject, or diffuse the problem before it exploded. If one of your parents was emotionally absent or distracted, you may have learned to earn attention by being easy, by being the good kid, the helper, the one who didn't cause problems. Over time, this morphs into people pleasing, where your needs always come second to keeping others calm and happy. And I can absolutely relate to that one because my mom was a single mom. She became a mom very young. She was 17 when she had me. And so my middle sister, I think that she would absolutely agree with this. And those of you who know her know, she was definitely a handful. And so I was always helping. I was always just trying to keep the peace. It was like um, the glue that held the peace and the calm together as much as possible. I have actually been told this as an adult, like later on. But anyway, just to give you an idea. I know that that might surprise some of you now who know me that I was ever a people pleaser, but yes, in a past life, I was a people pleaser. And over many years of struggling and being in abusive relationships, and I can still go back to that people pleasing, but anyway, little sidebar about me. Back to it. Some of us grew up in homes where conflict was constant but never resolved. In this case, you may have internalized the belief that conflict is dangerous or that speaking up isn't worth it. So you don't. You bottle it up, brush it off, and focus on staying safe emotionally, mentally, or even physically. And I can also relate to that. I learned very early on that expressing my feelings was not safe. And for those of you who did listen to episode 1 of this mini series, I did talk a little bit about being told to stop crying and being spanked more when I didn't stop crying. So other times you might have been the peacekeeper, the fixer, the one who translated between fighting parents or calmed a younger sibling down while trying to manage your own feelings in the background. That role teaches you early that your value lies in being the one who smooths everything over. I feel a little bit attacked by my own writing. When emotional labor is a survival skill in childhood, it becomes second nature in adulthood. You anticipate your partner's moods without being asked. You de escalate tension before it surfaces. You downplay your emotions because expressing them never felt safe. This is attachment trauma. And it doesn't disappear when we grow up. It gets reenacted, replayed, repackaged in our adult relationships. We become the emotional regulators in our partnerships, not because we want control, but because we've never known anything else. And here's the kicker: we are often praised for it, for being so understanding, so level headed, so emotionally intelligent. But under that praise is a child who learned to trade authenticity for acceptance or for peace. And that trade catches up to us eventually. You might find yourself exhausted after every interaction, confused by why no one ever checks in on you the way you check in on them, feeling like your partner is constantly leaning on you emotionally, but you have nowhere to lean on in return. That's not a coincidence. It's a pattern, and it's one that many of us didn't choose, but we can start to change. Next, we'll explore how this shows up in daily life, what emotional labor actually looks like in real time. Let's talk about how this plays out in relationships where there are no kids, because emotional labor doesn't begin and end with parenting. It shows up in romantic partnerships, friendships, even roommates. Often one person becomes the default everything: the planner, the emotional barometer, the crisis manager. They're the one who knows when bills are due, when someone's been quiet for too long, who needs to be followed up with, or which friend group is due for a check in. They're also the one who's most likely to manage holiday plans, family obligations, and partner scheduling, even if their partner is completely capable. This role is rarely assigned. No one sits down and says, "Hey, I'd like to be responsible for managing our entire family and emotional ecosystem." But it happens. And it often happens to the person who has been trained by family, by gender roles, by trauma to anticipate, to smooth, to carry. So what begins as just taking care of things becomes a full time, invisible job. You don't just carry the weight, you carry the responsibility for everyone else from feeling the weight. And it's not just what you do, it's what you know. You know who's mad. You know what's been unsaid. You know when something feels off, even if no one's admitting it. You're the default. And the hardest part, most people don't realize they're relying on you this way. You become the person who always just knows what to do, how to help, how to calm, how to fix. Meanwhile, the other partner or other person in whatever type of relationship this may believe they're easy to be with. They go with the flow, they're laid back. But what they don't see is that they get to be that way because someone else is holding the structure. And society makes this even worse because we don't just ignore emotional labor, we glorify the people who take it on. We praise women who do it all, who hold everything together, who don't ask for help. We call them strong, selfless, resilient. But let's be honest, strength in this case is often just code for silently suffering. I can absolutely relate to this. There have been so many times where I've been told how strong I am or how resilient I am, and I was in some of the worst mental and emotional places in my life. And I was even asking for help, and people were being like, "Oh, but you're so strong. You've got this." Thank you. I didn't. And I even said, "I don't got this." But I'm so resilient. I'm so brave. And the partners and the partners who don't carry emotional labor, they're praised too. They're praised for being easygoing or chill or not dramatic. That dynamic becomes a cultural punchline. One person does the heavy lifting and the other gets the reward for seeming carefree. This praise can be especially harmful because it masks inequality as personality. It reinforces the idea that the person doing the labor is just naturally more nurturing or organized or emotionally intelligent, and the other partner is just wired differently. But emotional labor is not a personality trait. It is a skill, and skills can be learned, shared, and redistributed. If we stopped glorifying burnout as strength, we might actually start having more honest conversations about balance. Because the truth is, if someone's holding it all together, it usually means no one else is helping to hold them. Next, let's break down how all of this starts to show up in our everyday behaviors, the tiny daily acts of emotional labor that keep relationships running under the surface. For many trauma survivors, especially those who experienced emotional neglect, abuse, or instability, emotional labor becomes a survival strategy, as I mentioned before. You overcompensate emotionally because somewhere along the way, you learned that being useful was the best way to be loved, that making things easier for others kept you safe. You learned to read the room, cushion the blow. You learned that if you could manage other people's reactions, you might be scared, you might be spared from their anger or absence. And over time, you began to equate emotional labor with worth. You feel valuable when you're needed. You feel secure when you're fixing. You feel connected when you're holding things together. But emotional labor, when done out of fear or obligation, becomes a form of self abandonment. And that abandonment can become so routine, so automatic that you don't even notice it's happening until you're angry, depleted, or quietly hoping someone else will finally ask how you're doing. These roots, social, familial, psychological, they all intertwine and they create an emotional script we carry into every relationship until we learn how to rewrite it. Now that we looked at where emotional labor comes from, let's talk about how it actually shows up in our day-to-day lives and our relationships. Because sometimes it's not dramatic, it's usually quite subtle, quiet, hidden behind habits that feel normal and are actually part of a much bigger pattern. So let's start with some relationship examples. Think about your own experiences here. Who usually initiates the hard conversations in your relationship? Who checks in after conflict to make sure things feel resolved? Who notices when the vibe is off and brings it up? Who remembers dates, appointments, your partner's triggers, or upcoming stressors? Who is usually regulating their tone and timing so that the other person doesn't feel uncomfortable? If you find yourself answering me to most of these questions, you're probably carrying a disproportionate amount of emotional labor. Sometimes the labor is done openly, but more often it's done in the background, silently, as part of some sort of unspoken rule. You bring things up because if you don't, no one will. You hold things back just in case the timing isn't right. You soften the truth so that the other person doesn't spiral. You apologize to keep the peace, even when you're not sure that you did anything wrong. And when that becomes your normal, it becomes exhausting. This kind of emotional labor also shows up in what I call emotional forecasting. You're always predicting the emotional weather in the relationship. You sense the storm before it hits. You're constantly tracking, adjusting, protecting. Not necessarily because your partner is unsafe, but because you've become the one who manages the emotional climate. Here's an example. You wake up early to prep your partner's lunch because they had a rough day yesterday and they don't even notice. You avoid venting about your coworker because you know your partner's patience is thin today. You plan a family get together and think through everyone's triggers to make sure nobody feels left out. You write a thoughtful text to check in and never get a reply, but still keep reaching out. That's emotional labor, quiet, constant, unthanked, and often unnoticed. Let's talk for a minute about emotional double standards. When a woman gets emotional, she's often seen as unstable, dramatic, too sensitive, or irrational. Dare I say, a bitch? But when a man gets emotional, when he tears up during a meaningful conversation or opens up about how something's painful, he's praised. Wow, he's so in touch with his feelings. He's not like other guys. The same behavior gets two very different responses depending on who's doing it. And that makes emotional labor even harder because the person doing the emotional work often isn't even allowed to express how hard it is. Or worse, they do express it and it gets dismissed or criticized, labeled as complaining, overreacting, or needing too much. This dynamic shows up across all kinds of relationships: romantic, familial, platonic, and even professional. And the hardest part, emotional labor, like I said earlier, is often invisible and goes unnoticed until it's withdrawn. Here's what I mean. You're the one who always texts first, and then one day you stop, and suddenly the silence stretches. You're the one who always apologizes first, and then you don't. And now the tension is lingering way longer than it normally would or should. You're the one who usually asks how they're doing, who plans the date nights, who says, I miss you. And when you stop, the connection fades slowly, quietly, because no one else is used to picking up the slack. They might even say, like, hey, is everything okay? They might notice it and not be able to name it. I feel like that happens pretty commonly when you stop doing the emotional labor. A lot of people do notice and they just can't quite pinpoint what it is that has changed. That's when the impact of emotional labor becomes clear. Not in what's happening, but in what stops happening when you put it down. And that's why it's so important to make the invisible visible, to see these patterns before they break something you care about. Not so you can take on more work, but so you can share the work more fairly. Because real partnership isn't about who naturally notices things. It's about choosing to care enough to learn to notice, to listen, to hold space, and to show up. So let's talk a little bit about what this feels like in relationships. I asked listeners to share their experiences, and the stories that came in were so layered, so familiar, and honestly kind of heartbreaking in their honesty. Story one woman shared, sometimes I'll psych myself out. Oh, this isn't a big deal. Or they said everything was fine, but I know in my gut it's not. Still, I ignore it just to avoid conflict. Other times, I'll harp on something I'm passionate about and not realize the other person is ready to move on. Let's sit with that. This is emotional labor in two directions. First, the internal conversation we have with ourselves to not speak up, to minimize our intuition in the name of keeping the peace. That's a form of labor, constantly managing your own discomfort so it doesn't inconvenience someone else. Then on the other side, there's the harping, the circling back, the over explaining, the trying again and again to feel understood. When someone feels like their truth isn't landing, they don't just stop, they start working harder. And that too is emotional labor. The labor of trying to bridge the gap that the other person may not even see. Have you ever told yourself not to bring up something because it wasn't worth the fight, but it still sat heavy in your chest anyway? What might change if you trusted that feeling instead of just swallowing it and suppressing it? So, to continue with this listener feedback, it's hard when you're trying to explain your perspective and they just don't agree, especially when it's tied to their lived experience. I've learned to stop pushing, but it's hard to let go when it feels personal. This is emotional labor in the space between belief and belonging. It's trying to be understood without being dismissed. And when the person across from you doesn't or can't meet you there, it becomes exhausting. The emotional labor here is in the translation, in trying to reframe, explain, clarify, or soften, all so that someone can see what you mean, even if they don't agree. That takes an enormous amount of energy. And often you're doing it alone. Have you ever felt like you had to work to be understood, especially around something that felt deeply personal or tied to your values? Did that effort feel worth it? Or did it leave you feeling more alone? Then there was a message from a male listener, and I think it captures a different angle of emotional labor. He said, we don't talk finances. She can see what's in my account, but I can't see hers. I've asked her to chill with traveling, but she doesn't listen. Her job is about to strike, and she might be out of work. It's frustrating, but she doesn't cheat. She works hard, so I eat it most of the time. And he followed it with this. She grew up super independent. I've changed so much for her. She hasn't really, but it's taught me patience I never knew I had. This is such a nuanced example. On one hand, You have the emotional labor of acceptance, the kind that doesn't come with conversations or feedback loops. It's internal. It's the silent compromise for the sake of love or peace. I'll just deal with it becomes the mantra. There's also the emotional labor of managing expectations in a relationship where values around transparency or fairness aren't shared. And again, it's invisible. He's not congratulated for his patience. He just has to live with it. If you've ever just eaten it in a relationship, let something go, held back, compromised quietly, what was the cost to you? Did you feel seen? Or did you just become better at hiding it? These stories are different, but the general theme is the same. Emotional labor is exhausting. It's not just about how we feel, it's about what we do with those feelings. It's the work of holding a relationship together from the inside out. And whether that emotional labor looks like staying silent or saying too much, managing someone else's comfort or burying your own, it all takes a toll. The good news is that once you start seeing these patterns, you can begin to name them. And once you name them, you can start to renegotiate how much you carry and what it would look like to share the load. So you might be wondering what happens when emotional labor goes unacknowledged, unreciprocated, or unnoticed for too long. The toll it takes can look like a lot of different things: burnout, resentment, emotional numbness, even outright distancing. You start to feel like a shell of yourself. You stop bringing things up, you stop reaching out, you stop caring. Not because you actually don't care, but because it hurts too much to keep carrying alone. Burnout from emotional labor doesn't always look like dramatic breakdowns. Sometimes it just looks like a very quiet withdrawal. You're still showing up, still going through the motions, but something in you is just tired, spent. It might feel like avoiding conversations because you already know how they'll go. Nodding along even though you're hurting because it's easier than explaining. Starting to believe that your needs really are too much. And then there's resentment. The creeping anger that builds over time when you keep giving more than you're getting. When you've had the same conversations different ways and nothing changes. When your partner forgets the thing you reminded them about 5 times, but expects you to remember every detail of their stress. Resentment is sneaky. It doesn't always explode, it simmers. It starts to color your tone, your patience, and your willingness to engage. You start to feel bitter instead of bonded. Then there's emotional numbness. When you've carried so much for so long, you start to get cold. You stop reacting, you stop feeling. You disconnect, not just from your partner, but from yourself. Sometimes the person carrying the emotional labor starts to overfunction in other areas to compensate for how unseen they feel. You work harder. You micromanage. You double down on doing because somewhere inside you're still hoping someone will notice. And let's not forget the loneliness. Being the only one trying is profoundly isolating. It's not just that you feel unsupported, it's that you feel invisible. You find yourself in a cycle. You bring something up, they shut down or get defensive, you explain, they still don't get it. Then you feel guilty for saying anything, so next time you say nothing. Over explain, shut down, guilt, silence, repeat. All of this chips away at your connection, not just with your partner, but with yourself. Because when you're constantly monitoring and managing someone else's reality, your own gets lost in the process. Emotional labor without any reciprocation isn't just tiring, it's unsustainable. Eventually, something breaks, and often it's the person who's been holding everything together. So, if you've been feeling on edge, disconnected, or like you're doing all the emotional work, this might be why. And you're not crazy, you're not dramatic, and you're definitely not asking for too much. You're just tired, and you're allowed to be. The next step is learning how to name what you're experiencing and how to begin shifting the balance. When something is invisible, it becomes impossible to address. You can't fix what you can't see. Or worse, what you've been taught isn't even real. Emotional labor is often dismissed because it's intangible. It doesn't leave behind dishes or dirt. It doesn't make noise. It's quiet, internal, and deeply felt. Making the invisible visible is the first and most powerful step. When we name emotional labor, we're not creating a problem. We're identifying an existing imbalance. And once it has a name, it becomes something we can talk about, something we can share, something we can shift. There's a phrase I come back to often: naming is neutralizing. It doesn't mean we eliminate the issue just by saying it, but it does take away some of the shame or self doubt. When you name something, you separate it from your identity. You go from thinking, why am I like this? To, I see what this is. When you can say, I'm carrying emotional labor that we've never talked about, it opens a door. It might feel scary at first, especially if you've been taught not to make waves, but it can also be empowering. Ask yourself, where is this pattern showing up in my life? In which relationship am I doing most of the emotional lifting? Am I anticipating needs more than expressing my own? Do I feel guilt when I let go of emotional responsibility or relief? These questions aren't about placing blame. They're about clarity, about understanding your role in the dynamic. Not so you can shame yourself or your partner, but you can decide if this role still feels fair, sustainable, and aligned with who you want to be. Because acknowledging isn't the same as blaming. You can say, this hurts, without saying, this is your fault. You can say, I need more support, without saying, you're failing me. What you're doing when you name emotional labor is holding up a mirror, not just to your partner or the relationship, but to yourself. You're saying, I matter too. My experience matters. And I want to show up in this relationship as a whole person, not just the emotional anchor who holds everything together. Naming emotional labor is the first act of reclaiming your emotional space. And it's an invitation, not a confrontation, an invitation to rework the dynamic, to redistribute the work, to co create something more balanced. And it starts with one simple, powerful truth: you don't have to carry this alone. Now that we've named emotional labor and explored how it shows up, let's talk about what you can actually do. You don't and you can't fix this overnight. And you definitely don't have to do it perfectly. What matters is that you start with awareness and you make conscious choices about what you continue to carry and what you decide to set down. Ask yourself honestly, where am I carrying the emotional labor? Where have I taken on responsibility that no one explicitly asked me to take, but I took it anyway? Where do I drop the labor? And is someone else actually picking it up? Or is it just getting dropped completely? Sometimes we hold on to emotional labor because it gives us a sense of control, or because it makes us feel useful, or because we're afraid of what will happen if we don't. But you get to ask, is this still serving me? Is it sustainable? Practice naming what you need without an apology. This can be uncomfortable, especially if you're used to cushioning everything you say. But learning to express your needs clearly is key. Try saying, I need you to help me carry this, not just by responding, but by initiating sometimes too. Or, I'm not okay with being the only one doing the emotional follow up after conflict. This isn't about demanding perfection from your partner. It's about inviting them into the process of the shared emotional responsibility. Ask your partner to take the lead. Sometimes it's not that your partner doesn't care, it's that they genuinely don't even know how to step in and have never been asked to. Invite them to take the initiative. You can say things like, can you be the one to bring up the next hard conversation if something feels off? Or, I'd like not to always be the one who notices when we're disconnected and brings it up. You're not just asking for help, you're asking for partnership. And it's okay to be direct about that. Create collaborative check ins. Instead of waiting for conflict or burnout to trigger a conversation, build in regular moments to connect intentionally. This could be a weekly check in where you both share how you're feeling, what's going well, and what could use more support. Make it a two-way street. If you're always the one checking in, eventually you'll start to feel the emotional parent instead of like a partner. Shift from equality to equity. This part is crucial. Equality means we both do the same thing. Equity means we both contribute in a way that considers our different capacities, needs, and context. In some seasons, you might carry more, but equity means checking in regularly and making adjustments. It means noticing when your partner is burning out and saying, let me take this one. Here's the difference. Equality says we both take turns bringing up conversations. Equity says, I know this week has been heavy for you, so I'll hold that space and we'll rebalance later. Equality says we both express our needs. Equity says, you've always been the one to hold things in, so I'll practice listening more and making it more safe to speak. Equity isn't about perfect fairness. It's about recognizing when someone is carrying more than their share and choosing to step in before they break. Finally, remember this. You can't change this pattern alone, but you can disrupt it. You can stop automatically saying yes. You can choose not to overfunction. You can speak up about what's not working anymore. And if your partner is truly committed to growing with you, they'll meet you there. Maybe awkwardly at first, certainly and most likely imperfectly, because we are all imperfect people, but they'll come closer because emotional labor doesn't have to be a solo act. It can be shared, it can be named, and it can be transformed. So here we are. We've talked about what emotional labor is, where it comes from, how it shows up, how it wears us down, and what we can start to do about it. If you're listening and realizing, oh, wow, I've been carrying so much, I want to say this to you directly. You're not alone. You are not imagining the weight of what you feel. You're not being too sensitive. You are not expecting too much. You're someone who's been doing the invisible work of love and connection, and that deserves to be seen. And if you are listening and realizing, oh, wow, my partner is doing a lot, that's okay. You're not doing something wrong. The first step is realizing and recognizing that you can shift this now. Now that you know about it, now that you see it for what it is, you can start supporting making that shift too. This episode is just one step, one opening, one moment to pause and ask, where am I doing emotional labor? And where would I like to share it? What would change if I stopped carrying it all alone, or if my partner stopped carrying it all alone and I started picking up more? I love to hear your thoughts. Please continue to share your stories, your reflections. You can DM me on Instagram or on TikTok at teatime.tara, or head to teatimetara.com, where I am working on maintaining a blog that will be kind of a follow-up support to this entire series. Please bear with me. I am working on establishing a routine. I think that some of this is just that I'm a perfectionist. I definitely just randomly woke up early and decided I should hurry up and do this before everybody wakes up and it gets a little noisy. My street is nice and quiet, and I love sitting outside on the porch, but it can get really hot. And I'm starting to get a little I'm starting to glisten a little bit. As you can see, for those of you who are watching, my hair is crazy. I'm not wearing any makeup. I literally just rolled out of bed and pulled out my computer. So thanks for being here with me. On the next episode of this series, we're digging into emotional safety, what it really is, and why so many people have never experienced it. We will also be covering how we can begin creating it in our relationships. Until then, thank you for listening. Thank you for showing up. And as always, speak your truth and don't take anyone's shit. Bye.